Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Friday night for the 2017 Harold Hotelling Memorial Lecture. For those of us who worked with Harold and those of us in the Humanities Department in particular, this is a very special evening for us, so thank you for coming out and joining us for this. I'd like to begin the event tonight by asking Dr. Modgill, Lawrence Tech's president, to come up and say a few words of welcome to you all. Dr. Modgill.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Are you here? Good evening. Well, this is a tradition that we're so proud of. Many of you have come through the campus. You see the advancement and growth of the campus, programs, buildings, ideas. We continue to evolve, but we still embrace the past that is very important to us. And that is why we are here this evening, to pay tribute to a professor who left a great legacy for all of us. Harold taught economics and law. He was known for his integrity, mentorship, and people loved him. I think this is the 8th anniversary or 8th year of these lectures series, which is treasured by all, and many of you are return comers to this lecture, and I appreciate that. With us to partake in this great event is the family from our person we are honoring. So Harold Hartling's family, Mrs. Hartling is here. Barbara, if you could raise your hand. Thank you. And their son, George, is here. George, thank you. And we have many special guests, but let me start with the first one. And that is we have with us Dr. William Shingleton from North Carolina. He came from North Carolina for this evening. Why he thought it was so important? Because he was a friend of Harold, and they went to school together. And in 1983, they both graduated. Harold, of course, went first to law, then he got the PhD. So, Bill, if I may call you, thank you very much for being here. This lecture is also important because in humanities, it's really a group of ideas more than a discipline. Anything that is innovative originates right from here, and this lecture is no different. With that, I welcome you all. We have some important guests who are almost the brick wall of this university. Dr. Marburger, who is here with us, Richard Marburger, he's our 4th president, and he blesses all these events. Dr. Marburg, if you could raise your hand, please. With his initiative and support, we have made many outreach collaborations, but one that is almost next door, I said there are no silos between Lawrence Tech and Manugian High School, and whose principal, Josep Torzian, with us. Thank you. There's one other person who saw and felt and was very friend of Harold right across the street from their home. They were family friends, is Dr. Right here from Rochester Hill, Anil Sachdev. Dr. Sachdev, you can raise your hand. Dr. Sachdev's family lived just across the street, and they knew each other very well. With that, I welcome you. I'm glad you took time. We have many important things to follow my brief remarks, so I hope you enjoy the evening and continue your association with Lawrence Tech. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Modgill. And now I'd like to ask Professor Corrine Stavish to come up and say a few words of remembrance of our dear friend Harold.
To live in the hearts we leave behind is not to die, and Harold Hotelling lives in our hearts. His death brought us great sadness, but his memory brings us great joy. There's not a week that goes by that Dr. Jason Barrett, who's chairman of our Humanities, Social Sciences, and Communication Department, does not say at one time or another, quoting Harold Hotelling, always certain, frequently wrong. Joyce McKisson, our department secretary, remembers Harold's friendship because when her husband Rick was out of work and things were very hard for them, Harold, our friend, brought her a gift certificate right at this time with a turkey. Right at Thanksgiving, brought a turkey and a gift certificate so that Joyce and Rick could go out to dinner and have a nice evening, even though Rick was out of work. And Joyce promised, when things get better, we'll take you and Barbara out to dinner. And that promise was kept. Things got better. Professor Barry Kanister, who's with us this evening, is a retired humanities professor, and he remembers Harold's rejoinder when someone commented on Harold's being a little stout. Yes, he said, it's intentional. Everyone I ever saw who was sick was thin. Barry added to that, to this day, I miss the man. No one I ever knew at LTU was more congenial and life-enhancing. Professor Holly Helterhoff remembers being new to the faculty and dealing with a tough problem and moaning to Harold that the outcome was poor. But what Harold reminded her was, you spoke to the right person about it. You can't do more than that. And those wise words comforted her and still guide her today. Harold's wisdom included wit, and my favorite memory of Harold was more than 20 years ago when a young professor who was working in our department as in technical and professional communication had his second child just a little over a year after his first child. And so things were really difficult for him and for his wife. And without asking, Harold showed up on their doorstep one night and said, go out to dinner and enjoy the evening. I'm here to babysit. I'm the father of 5 children. I'm qualified. And Jim and Sylvia Lentz went out to dinner and remembered that the kindness, the generosity, that's who Harold was to all of us. So he had a huge heart matched by his huge smile. You can see that in the picture. He lives in the hearts of his family, his friends, his colleagues. If you didn't know Harold, then at the reception afterwards, find somebody who did and ask for another Harold Hotelling story, and then your heart will be filled as well.
Thank you, Professor Stavish. And so for 8 years, we have done a remarkable job, I think, finding speakers to come in each year and talk about topics that are relevant and timely. We were just chatting before we started. Some of you who were here 2 years ago will remember the visitor we had from the University of Michigan, his name escapes me at the moment, who spent an hour telling us that there was a 100% certainty that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be enacted, that all of the politicians yammering on about being opposed to the TPP could not possibly change the overwhelming economic advantages. Brian remembers that talk. So if you were in the room for that discussion and then followed the last 18 months of American politics, you were in a position to be well informed on the issues, and I think that is as fitting a tribute to Harold as we could probably perform here. So we're going to continue that great tradition tonight with another compelling speaker who is talking about issues that are timely in the news. Dr. Daniel Carroll joins us from the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, where he is a research economist. His primary work is in income inequality and public policy. And again, if you've been following the news for the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks or the last 4 hours, it is full of discussions about income inequality and the public policy implications. I do just want to give a special welcome because as I was noticing, reading through his biography, Dr. Carroll and I have 2 other connections. Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington is one of the most beautiful campuses, one of the most beautiful regions of the country. And when I was out there in my teens backpacking, I was so inspired. I sent an application, was accepted. I did not ultimately make the move out to the West Coast, but we have a second connection, which is our Cavalier status from the University of Virginia. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Carroll to the podium with a wahoo. Please come, Dr. Daniel Carroll, please.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me out. It's a great honor, and just spending some time at the reception, speaking with the family, speaking with colleagues that knew Harold, it really impressed upon me how special it was to be invited. That you would think to have me here is really an honor. So thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoy. And then I also want to say that I hope this engenders discussion, so please feel free to ask questions. I don't know if it's customary to interrupt during the presentation, but typically as an economist in lectures, that happens all the time. So I'm comfortable with that. So if something's really bothering you, or if you really don't understand a slide and I did a terrible job, please stop me and say something. Otherwise, we can wait till later. But anyway, I hope that you enjoy it. So, all right. So I've entitled this Opportunity in America, okay? This is on issues related to income and wealth inequalities, it says, and mobility. And this is all central to my research in economics. Most of my economic research, I think about how economic policy, of course, affects the economy. But a revolution that's happened in macroeconomics especially, micro people knew about this a long time ago, but in macroeconomics, my field, is to try to take seriously the fact that people are actually different, okay? That people have different income levels, different wealth levels, different ages, different experiences, they're heterogeneous. And so this whole field of heterogeneous agent macroeconomics, where you try to model this stuff and take it seriously and think about the effects across the distribution, have become really big over the last 25, 30 years and changed the way that we do macro today. So I don't know, this is exciting for me. And then I should also say that Nicholas Hoffman helped me tremendously. He's an RA at the Fed and actually a co-author on another piece of work, so he was excellent and instrumental in putting these together. Okay. So, oh yes, and I do work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, so it is imperative that I let everyone know that the Federal Reserve does not agree with anything I'm about to say, right? They should, but no. No, so I have to say the views expressed here are solely mine, and they do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland or the Federal Reserve System as a whole. Okay. All right, so the American dream, right? So in the short piece that I wrote to introduce this, it talked about the American dream. And in all the public talks that I've seen, someone usually has a really nice, like an English dictionary definition. So I thought I would try to follow in the footsteps. So I like this definition for our purposes today. It says the ideal that every U.S. citizen should have an equal opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work, determination, and initiative. So what we're thinking about is this idea that in America, your current means don't necessarily dictate where you'll end up, and that you can move to whatever successful state you want through the right behavior, right? Maybe through risk-taking, or maybe through hard effort and integrity. Okay, so that's kind of the optimistic view. Now, given the topic, I'd said, the second thing that speakers do is they usually have a cool quote, right? So, I'm sure all the humanities people here will say, they're grown, that maybe I'm too cliche. But this really struck me for the topic tonight. And I love this book. I'm sorry, I love this book. So, but just in the closing remarks of the Great Gatsby, the closing lines, their ghastly future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch our arms further, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Now, why would I bring this up? It stands in such contrast to the American dream idea. Well, my first picture tonight, this is something that Piketty and Saez at Berkeley, Emmanuel Saez, have studied IRS data and looked at inequality since really the beginning of income taxes, right? So in this chart, we start in 1929, so I'm thinking of the Great Gatsby time, right? High levels of income inequality. The highest really in the 20th century until you get all the way to the very end. So this is, I've picked the top 1% to show, but you could look at other parts of the distribution. And you see you start out very high income inequality, around 11% of total income in the economy is held by 1% of people, okay? And at that time, they were mostly rentiers, and mostly just endowed with wealth. But then the Great Depression comes along, we have some wars, unionization, marginal tax rates are very high, and you get this dip. And the share actually falls down pretty close to 2%. It's not exactly perfectly proportional, but much lower. And then somewhere, starting at the end of the 70s, actually I was born in 1979, so I can't rule out that I was the cause of this, but that somewhere at the end of the 70s, we began to see the rise of the concentration of income and wealth again. And so now we're back up to levels we hadn't seen since the really early in the 20th century. So what I want to do today, well, there's a couple of things actually that I want to do. So I want to lay out some facts from the data, right? Because I like to play around with the data, and so hopefully I can show you some cool pictures and I can explain them in a way that's compelling and interesting. I want to think about some factors, at least some of the principal ones, that economists think about when they try to explain the trends that I'm going to show. And then I want to at least keep in the background, in your minds, as you're thinking about this, which factors might we want to address? In the sense, is there something we want to correct? Or are these forces things that aren't necessarily bad, right? Because, you know, in a vacuum, so to speak, inequality in and of itself doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It really depends on why it's there, right? And how it affects the economy. And then if we think there's something that would be addressed, what kind of policies would be effective, right? What kind of policies would be effective? Okay, so two things on this. It's like my second disclaimer. So I was given some advice about how to do these things, right? And they said, first, don't be too political. And I said, okay. But of course, given the topic, I have to be careful. So I'm going to try to be as objective as I can. Now, given that I'm going to work hard on that side, the second piece of advice was, don't be too technical. So I hope that you'll forgive me if I get a little bit technical tonight, because it's just my comfort zone. So please bear with me. All right, so let's first start with inequality, income and wealth inequality, and then we'll move to mobility. All right, so here I've plotted the Gini coefficient. So for those of you who aren't aware of what a Gini coefficient is, I had 5 slides on how it's put together, and then I decided at the last minute you guys don't want to see how it's put together. I made an executive decision. Basically, it's a number that goes between 0 and 1, okay? The closer you get to 1, the more unequally distributed some resource is, right? So, for instance, if it was 0, it would mean that that resource is perfectly shared among every single person in the economy. If it goes to 1, it means that a single person holds everything, okay? So the closer you get to 1, the more unequal, the more concentrated those resources become. So this is for market income. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. And you can see it starting in the 70s, as we show, we were around 4.6, 4.7, moderate amount of income inequality, but not tremendously high. And then ever since then, it's just steadily rose until now it sits around 0.6. So market income here is just the salary that you get when you work in the labor market. It's the returns that you get on your capital. Okay, so there are all these sources, but importantly, it's before the government is involved. Okay, so you can plot this Gini. You can also compare it to after the government has come in. So this is the after-tax income Gini. So that's after you pay your taxes, right? And after the government gives you some transfers that you may or may not be owed based on the law. Given that we have a progressive tax schedule, and given that we tend to give benefits to people with more need, that tends to reduce inequality. But something I want to show is that, yes, while it's lower inequality level than market income, the basic trend is the same. We haven't undone the trend in inequality. It's still rising even after the government intervention. Okay, so what's behind the steep rise, right? What's the story? Well, a couple prominent stories, but first I want to start with a distribution. This is a picture. This is a distribution. I tend to throw out the word distribution, and I assume everyone is like super familiar with distributions. But this is a distribution over something. I haven't actually said here, but you know, you guys have probably seen bell curves, and maybe some of you work more closely with distributions, but this is the population, right? The population over some resource. We can think of income here, because that's what we're talking about at the moment. As we move from left to right, you get higher and higher income, and this shows what fraction of the population has exactly some level of income. Okay. So imagine this is your income distribution in the US. It's not quite perfect, but if it's something like this. Now, the two stories I want to bring up, two kind of key facts I think everyone needs to understand about income inequality, is that there's really two parts to this story. So here I've put in a second distribution. This distribution is more unequal. Okay? And there's actually two factors behind the inequality here. The first is something you've probably heard a lot in the news, right? That the upper tail of income is stretching out. That, like I showed in the previous pictures, income is becoming more and more concentrated among fewer and fewer people. Okay? And that does drive up inequality. That does drive up inequality. But that's not the only thing that's happening in the income distribution that increases inequality. The second is that the middle is spreading out. Okay? The middle's spreading out. So even among, most of us that aren't, very, very, very high income, there's differences that are driving inequality between essentially the middle class, the broad middle class. Okay? So I want to talk about first the upper tail issue. So, like I said, you get greater and greater concentration among a small fraction of the population. And here I indicated less than 1%. And I did that on purpose because 1% gets thrown around a lot, right? We are the 99% and 1% and this back and forth. And it's usually done because it's simple. It's a nice, nobody wants to talk about the decimals, right? That's not that exciting for most people. So we stick with 1%. But it's important to understand that really a lot of this that's going on is inside of the 1%. There's a lot of inequality even within the 1%. So here I'm showing percentage of total income we've worked with before. Here's the bottom 90%, right? Share has been decreasing. So you're up almost to 70, now we're down to 50% of income held by, in a given year, by the bottom 90%. Now let's think about the people who are kind of in that sweet spot between 90%, and here I have the half percent, the top percent. Yes, the share for these well-paid types, right, has been rising, but it's not that precipitous, right? It's not really driving things in the tail. If you look at even the top half of a percent, so top half of a percent you can think of for 2016 an income of about $660,000. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, but it's not, you don't necessarily take your yacht to Monaco or something on this, right? Okay? But they've gone from having a very small share, 4% or so, now up to 11. 11% of income in a year goes to 0.5% of the economy. Look at it in terms of growth, right? So here, the bottom 90, middle 90, 95, 95, 99, so this is still almost everybody. And you see that there's been growth. I've indexed it to 100 here from the 70s. You see it's pretty flat, and again, we see it starting up around 1979 when I was born. And then this thing starts to fan out, right? Less going to the bottom 90, a little bit more going to 90, 95, 95, 99. But if we take a look at the really tip-top types, 0.1%. So now we're getting pretty rich. Now you're in the millions, a million or two a year. You can see that the growth has been tremendous to that part of the distribution. There's something else that's kind of interesting to look at when you see that, is that notice how much more volatile it is, right? Know how much more it moves. And if you're really perceptive and you're really into it, you might notice that the movements aren't completely random, right? You can see that the big downward movements are in recessionary periods, which tells you that a lot of the income that these individuals are getting is coming from market, is closely tied to the market. So either through capital or through, often in this case, bonuses if you're a laborer, bonuses that are tied to market performance. So you have this it's very, very volatile, but on average it's been a tremendous growth. Okay, so who are these people? That's usually what I wonder when I see this stuff. I be like, who are these lucky people? Yeah, how do I become one? No. Well, it's actually important to think about who these people are, especially if we're going to talk about the 1%. Okay? So if you're talking about people in the 1% who maybe they're not in the 0.5 necessarily, and certainly not in the 0.1, well, these are primarily laborers, actually. Okay? How do they get there? They're very high earners. They were very successful, perhaps in school. They chose a profession that pays well. They might be surgeons, like we have here. You might be an attorney who's a senior partner that's vested in the firm, and you get some equity return on the firm. There are some academics, it turns out, but usually you might want to be married to another academic. Where do they work? Yeah. There's some fields, but we'll keep that going. Yeah, well, okay. And then senior managers, right? So you pick out executives and managers who really have built up human capital in relations with people and ideas and projects. Versus, say, this top 0.01% or even 0.1%. In order to get to that $11 million a year mark, you're either a superstar athlete, you often are an entrepreneur that's just been amazingly successful. You might be the CEO of a very large firm. Most CEOs are not going to be making $11 million a year, but you'd be a CEO of a very large firm. And then the really kind of big chunk is coming from finance, right? So hedge fund managers, for instance. In fact, I remember I once was teaching a class at Case Western MBA students, and we were looking at income inequality. This was years ago, but post-recession. And I found out as I was digging around that in 1 year, like 2007, I believe, just before the crash, the top 10 hedge fund managers had made more money together than all the top 500 CEOs of large companies combined, right? The top guy had $2 billion in 1 year. Yeah. So, you know, it's not hard to start a hedge fund. It's hard to get people to give you your money, but yeah, and it's incredible. So why do I bring this up? Why is this distinction important? Why do I belabor this and who's in here? Well, because people often think about, for instance, I'm not going to mention a lot about taxes, although it's so relevant right now, and I'm certainly not going to say whether something's going to pass or not. But if you're thinking about how I might tax this income and what effects it would have, well, it really depends on who it falls on, right? Am I taxing the entrepreneur, the finance? Am I taxing the financier? Or am I going to tax, say, surgeons and attorneys, and academics who might make different choices for their labor, right? Especially ones who are thinking about becoming a surgeon and thinking about becoming a doctor. So these are productive laborers in some sense. So it's important to have that distinction that we don't think of 1% as monolithic. Okay? Another thing that's interesting about the top 1% is that many people don't remain in it very long. They kind of transition in and out of it. So I had Nick put this together just the other day. We went through the panel study of income dynamics, a beautiful data set that tracks people over time. And we said, okay, take some people who are in the top 1% in some given year. And then let's fast forward 2 years. Are they still in the top 1%? What fraction of people are still in the top 1%? Well, turns out on average, roughly 50% over time have remained in. So you've got a 50-50 chance you're still going to be in there. What about in 6 years? Right? Well, in 6 years, it's more like 35%. You're actually more likely not to be in the top 1% anymore. Why is that important? Well, for a lot of people doing this, it's a transitionary period. You get a big bonus, maybe you get a big severance package, maybe you sell a business, and then you're back out. And I think something that's very important when I read news about this subject, and everyone should read news about it, it's very interesting. But something that I think they're not careful to distinguish is that when they say that more money is going to the 1%, it doesn't necessarily talk about the same exact people. It's not as if there's some group of people who are kind of laughing and rubbing their hands, right? And just getting more and more and more. But the perception can feel that way, and it can make people a little bitter, right? So it's important to understand this is a transitory state for many people. Okay, so what about the second factor? That's the tail. What about the middle class? What's going on there? This is the term is hollowing out of the middle, right? What's happened there? Well, there's a couple of things. So one of the big ones we talk about is called skill bias technological change and job polarization. What's going on? Well, technological improvements in the last 20, 30 years, combined with globalization, more integrated markets, has allowed us to substitute out certain types of labor, certain types of jobs, and replace them with robots, machines, cheaper and more efficient technology. And so this has driven a wedge in the middle, right, between those who do, for instance, we call cognitive routine tasks that require you to think about what you're doing, but can be very repetitive, right? can be learned by a machine very easily, and those that use the machines to do their work, right? So in other words, you get a premium on a job that works with computers rather than fights against them, right? If you fight the computers, you're going to lose. And that's kind of partly what's happening here. So one of the ways that you generally end up working with the computers is by getting a higher level of education. And it's borne out in the data. You can see over, here we have it just since the 90s from the Census Bureau, but even over that period of time, you can look at the premium that goes to people who have a higher education. So what have I plotted here? This is the median income of a household, okay, based on the education of the head of household, all right? So if the household's headed by someone who doesn't have a high school diploma, some have some college but didn't complete, and someone has a bachelor's degree or a higher degree. And it's plotted relative to a high school earner. So a high school earner would run right along 1 right there. So you can see that if you don't have a high school diploma, you get knocked down. You got about 60% of what somebody who has a high school degree would get on the median, the average. If you have some college but didn't complete, you get about a 20% kick up. But both of those have been fairly flat over this period. However, if you have a bachelor's degree or higher, this has risen above the 100% premium and is now close to a 200% premium. So what is that doing again? It's taking those guys in the middle and pulling them up, right? Pulling them up while others remain behind. So another fact that people don't think about as often or talk about as often is what's called assortative matching. Basically, I mean, I met my wife in college, right? People tend to meet their partners and form households with people that are of similar education levels to them, right? So because they have a similar education level, often they have access to that same premium or not, right? And so when you put them together, you just exacerbate the difference across households, right? Now, what's been going on with that? Well, there's a couple interesting things in this. This is from some work by Jeremy Greenwood, famous, really great economist at Penn. So he examined 1960s. He said, okay, so and he restricted to husbands and wives. So we'd have no same-sex couples here. We don't have enough data yet to really say a lot there. But just looking at opposite-sex couples, right, husbands and wives, if you look at 1960 and you say, let's take the education of the wife down here on the bottom, right? Less than high school, I've combined high school and some college, or ones that have college and above. And who do they match with, right? So for instance, at this less than high school level, everything in this dark brown or this brown color here, all that fraction, about 75%, are matched with husbands who also don't have a high school education. If you turn to the people in the middle, their middle bar is the widest, right? The longest, suggesting that they're mostly matched with people of the same education level. And of course, you get out here to the college level, and women who had a college degree at the time tended to match with husbands who also did as well. Now, okay, so we know this happens, we know it stretches income inequality, but that doesn't necessarily tell us about the trend and why it's going up. Well, there's some evidence that this sort of matching pattern has actually increased as well. It's increased as well. So a couple things happened here, and it made the graph a little funny. One is, compared to 1960, the female population in the United States is much better educated, right? So there's just more better educated females. But they still tend to match with people in their same group. So for instance, this less than high school went down mostly because it's just harder to find people who have less than high school than it used to be. But if you look at the college side, more college women are matching with college men, college-educated men. And that's, again, giving them access to this premium and driving up household disparities in income. So another fact on that, so this was something else that's interesting, is just because you combine two people that have access to the premium doesn't necessarily mean that income inequality is going to expand. Something else that's happened since 1960 is that conditional on a woman who has a college education marrying a man with a college education, the woman is providing a larger fraction of the household income than they used to. So when you looked back at the data that he had a full table, and it was very interesting, you could see that in 1960, many of the women did not contribute much to the household income. Many chose not to work, right? Now it's much more common. And in fact, if you go to sort of the highest match among those who, he actually has a panel that is more than college here, you see that that women, they make up a very large fraction of the household income. If your wife has an MA or a PhD or a professional degree, that's a very valuable career, and they tend to work, right, and provide a lot. So again, not only are we matching people with access to the premium, but those that are matched with the premium tend to use it. Again, so you're driving the middle distribution apart. All right. I want to touch on wealth inequality, because it's really bad. I mean, not bad in a normative sense. I got to be careful about that. I told myself I wouldn't say that. It's very extreme. So wealth is a lot more unequally distributed, tremendously more. Okay? So this was just something we calculated the other day. So if you take the 400 richest people on the Forbes 400 for 2016, they have as much wealth as the bottom 40% combined. It's incredibly concentrated. So here's some wealth shares. You can kind of just like we did with the income, how much of total wealth belongs to a certain fraction of the population. You can see that bottom 90% has been falling precipitously. We're down under 25%. Meanwhile, the top 1% has 37% of the wealth in the economy. And it's very, very unequally distributed within that group as well. It's very, very concentrated. Look at the Gini coefficient. Remember, the Gini coefficients for market income, even the high ones before the government had any intervention, were only around 0.6. Right now, 0.86. It's extremely, extremely skewed distribution. All right. I want to talk just briefly about, again, understanding who these people are and who holds wealth in the distribution and how. So if we're talking about people in the wealth distribution, I would broadly characterize it as, if you take the bottom 25% of people ranked by wealth, they have basically no wealth. They have no net worth. Yeah. A good chunk of people have very, very low net worth in the United States. And if you're talking about people in that poorer range, you tend to rent, so you don't own a house. And so your largest assets tend to be durable goods. Car, you might have jewelry, right? You might have a few items. As you move up in your wealth, you buy a home, you start building up home equity, right? So for a broad part of the middle distribution, a house is their primary source of savings. It's where all their wealth is, nearly all of it. And as you get closer, you start moving up into really the 70s and the 80s percentiles, financial wealth starts to kick in. Some of these people are investing. They own some stocks, perhaps. They have 401k programs, and it begins to have more of a size of their portfolio, more of a share of their portfolio. And then when you get into the top 1%, it really shifts. Housing is very little, right? They have great houses usually, but it's not that big a deal in their portfolio. What they're holding is a lot of financial wealth, right? A lot of assets in the market, and they also have a very large amount of business wealth. So again, getting up to that really rich level tends to be through entrepreneurship and business. It tends to be that way. Now again, why does it matter? Why do I spend this time breaking this stuff out? Like, I mean, facts just to share aren't that exciting necessarily, but it matters again for policy, because when you ask who's affected by changes in tax policy, who's affected by the Great Recession, what moves wealth around and wealth inequality around, it depends on what you hold, what's your instrument for wealth. When the housing market crashes, who gets hurt? People who had all their concentration of wealth in housing, right? There's obviously knock-on effects, people lose their jobs and things like that, but in terms of the actual wealth decreasing, it comes through their house. What about the people in the 1%? How does theirs change? It changes because the market crashes, right? The market crashes and loses a tremendous amount of wealth. But if the market recovers much faster than the housing market recovers, you get more unequal wealth distribution. So it's important to think about how this wealth's composed in order to understand how policy affects different people differently. So I just put these portfolio shares together. By going with the 80 percentile, we've already kind of brought in a more even balance between finance and housing. But you can see housing still has a large share. And it's just like I was saying, as you move up the distribution, housing becomes a very small fraction of your portfolio. And it's all in the finances and in business. The other category is mainly business. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say a little bit about inequality, and I hope there were some nuggets of things that made us think about it a little differently maybe. This is an area that I, in the last few years, have started to work on, called mobility. And just real quick, because in when I've talked to the press, sometimes journalists have expressed some difficulty understanding the difference between inequality and mobility. And I think this analogy works really well. So it's like there's a race. Imagine a race, right, with 100 people running this race. Inequality is the distance between people at any given point in time, right? How far away is the top person front from the back, right? And how many people are up near the front versus the back at any point. Mobility is how frequently do these people change positions? How frequently does someone come up from the back of the pack to the front, and how frequently does someone fall back? That's mobility. And so really, when you think about what I started with the American dream, I haven't said anything about that. I've just talked to you about what the distributions look like, right? Mobility is really the essence of that American dream that we started with. Okay? It says that my current circumstances don't necessarily dictate where I end up. So the way I put this was, it doesn't necessarily imply there's less opportunity just because there's more inequality. It just means that the stakes are greater. It means that if you're a winner, you win more. And if you're a loser, it's a bigger loss. All right. So what's going on in the mobility front? What do we know? Well, so this is from Raj Chetty and some others. Raj Chetty's a brilliant economist who's been working on all sorts of amazing issues. And I'm going to use some of his research in these slides today because he's just excellent. He's done great work with big data to tell us all about what's going on with income and mobility. So here he's plotted by birth year, right? What was the percent of children that earned more than their parents? So if you're born back in the 40s, you had a 90% chance that you were going to make more than your parents whenever you're in your 30s and 40s. Okay? That has steadily decreased over time. All right? So that basically by the time I was born, again, it's 50% chance. 50-50 chance that you're going to earn more than your parents. Okay? And for some people here who are even younger, I don't know. It doesn't look good. But, you know. So some of that's, there's been decreasing productivity. There's been a lot of factors that have driven this down. But in terms of one way in which people think about mobility is, will my kids be better off than I was? Not necessarily. Not anymore. Not necessarily. All right. This other part of way of thinking about mobility relates to the race analogy. And this is a lot of how I use it in my work. Is I start with some distribution again. There's our friend, the distribution. Here I've called it a wealth distribution. I say, well, how else can we measure this stuff? Well, sorry, I'm getting a little technical, I hope not too much, but you can break this distribution into 5 parts, in which there are 20% of people in each bin. So we break into 5 even parts by population, poor people on this side, richer people on this side. And over a period of time, we can ask, who moves up and who moves down? Who makes a fall from the 5th percentile down into the 3rd, back into the middle? And who are the people that surge from the bottom to the top? And how much mixing actually occurs, right? This is critical. I do a lot of study of tax policy, actually. It's turned out in my models to be a critical factor in determining what optimal tax policy is in a model. Imagine this. We're thinking about redistributing, right? Let's say we live in this economy and we get to decide taxes for today. Now, we could choose to redistribute all this money. It's going to matter if you expect that regardless of your circumstances today, that you'll probably, if you're, say, near the bottom right now, that you'll probably be somewhere in the middle or near the top relatively soon. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because you don't want to pay those taxes later, right? You don't want to institute high taxes for the rich if you expect you're going to be rich pretty soon, if you think you have a pretty good chance of it. On the other hand, if you're a permanent serf, right, and the king's got all this money, and you have no chance of ever seeing any of it, you're going to love to redistribute. So it's actually really critical, and much of the tax literature in econ is focused on inequality and how that affects tax policy, but they haven't necessarily spent as much time thinking about mobility and how central it is to determining tax policy. This is one aspect of mobility. This is again from Raj Chetty. It's a beautiful graph, metropolitan areas, large and counties. So what he's done is he said, okay, let's plot out, if you're born in one of these little zones, what's the chance that a child born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution in the United States ends up in the top 20%, given that they live in one of these places? You can see it's not sort of randomly distributed across the country, right? Obviously, the South is very red, right? more ways than one. It's very red, and it means they have a very low probability. Also up into the Rust Belt, Michigan and Ohio, right? Out west, much less. In fact, in areas like Seattle, Silicon Valley, parts of New York, Texas, you have much better chance of rising. They do some studies of what are some things that are strongly correlated. So these aren't causal, but what are things that are strongly correlated with kids moving up? Well, is there less segregation within the neighborhood? More integrated neighborhoods tend to have kids that move up. Lower income inequality in the neighborhood, and better primary access to primary schools, right, that gets you on the track. These seem to be, they tend to go along with whatever is causing and driving upward mobility for these kids. So we did some work, this is on wealth mobility. We asked sort of a similar question. We said, what's the chance that if a family is in the bottom 20% by wealth, that in 10 years, they'll transition to a higher level, to the third quintile, fourth, or even the fifth quintile? Well, your chances of getting into the third over time have gotten a little better. But in general, your chances of making big movements has gone down. And we did this a little different way. This is, I won't get into the slides on the Chirac Index and the Bartholomew Index, although if you have a question, I'd love to tell you all about it. But in a really sort of brief way, the Chirac's Index on the right measures the stickiness of your initial position. If you're born in the whatever quintile, say the first quintile, the more likely you are to stay in that quintile over time, the higher, the lower the index will be, so less mobility you'll have. But it just cares about whether you stay in the same position. The Bartholomew's Index actually complements it very well. It says something slightly different. It says, conditional on moving out of your quintile, how far do you go? Do you make big movements or little movements? Well, when we looked at it looked at the sample for the PSID that we had, for the panel data that we had, we documented a decline at the 10-year horizon of people moving, right, of mobility. So mobility's actually gone down. So we've had more inequality and less mobility. All right, policy. And this was, for me, the hardest part of this. As an economist, I'm always a little hesitant without a great model to show everybody and explain to try to give policy. But I want to outline some broad ones, and I'm very interested in what people will bring up in discussion. First, in terms of wealth creation and wealth mobility. There's some low-hanging fruit here, so that's what I'm going to go for now. But I think fair access to credit is tremendous. I've done a little bit of work, and I'll touch on here in my closing remarks, on wealth for black versus white households. And in that study with one of my co-authors who's worked more in that area, I learned a tremendous amount over the years we worked on these papers about the frictions and conditions that African American households faced in the middle of the 20th century. Okay? So, and to some extent still face as well, right? So having fair access to credit allows you to buy houses and build up equity in them, right? So go back and study redlining if you don't know about this stuff. And also to create small businesses, which we've already know, first of all, they help feed back into the neighborhood, and they can, in some cases, be that engine that generates larger movements in wealth. And then, of course, this one is the one that just beats you over the head when we talk about skill bias, technological change, and job polarization. Education. Investing more equitably in our schools, right? I live in a great neighborhood, with a very nice neighborhood, and my kids go to a great public school. But I can go just a few miles down the road. My wife actually works with the Cleveland Metro School District. She works for college, but she recruits out of the Cleveland Metro School Districts. And it's really sad. It's really, really sad to see how little investment, and not just how little money, I mean, you pour money into it, but how little investment these kids really receive, and the tremendous frictions that they face. So thinking in this case of aid for children, I know a teacher who works in the Cleveland School District who talks about how they save food from all these meetings to make sure they can give to their kids, how they try to leave cafeterias open for the kids in summer so they have a place to come eat, right? When you face those kind of frictions in your life, it's extremely hard to think that you have a fair chance to move up. Subsidizing STEM fields, right? I hope that's not too controversial here. I think you guys will love that, right? But you want to work with the computers, and you want to encourage people to work with computers, right? And then finally, need-based aid. So I know personally I benefited tremendously from need-based aid and going to college, and I know others have as well. Again, the more we can try to give people a chance so that the next Einstein isn't stuck in Cleveland Metro school districts, right? The better. Speaking of higher education real quick, anyone who hasn't seen this from Raj Chetty's site, it's really, really interesting. You can use a New York Times interactive site to look at all sorts of schools. So I might have actually looked up LTU. But it's a mobility report card. And so what they say is, okay, let's think about the schools that put people into the top 20% of income. What are those schools? Well, one of them that might come to mind is Columbia. Well, sure, it's a great school, right? And it turns out, if you look at the top blue line there, that's, quote, the success rate, sticking your student in the top 20%. High number of them end up there. But then if you want to think about mobility, it doesn't say much if you're Columbia, right, that you stuck someone in the top 20% when an overwhelming number of the students in the entering class have parents that come from there, right? They came from a rich neighborhood. Of course, it's much easier for them. And so they downweight the scores based on that. So they ask something like, okay, let's see how many people do you put in that top 20%, and then let's offset it with how many students do you accept from the bottom 20%. And that's where you see the real engine for mobility in education is coming from grabbing these kids here. See, it's much more equally distributed, these red bars, and allowing them to move up. Okay? Look at Columbia, almost 14% of the kids have parents come from the top 1%. Columbia's a great school, and if you get in, you should definitely go, probably. I mean, unless you get some like done better. But the point is, if we think about it from a policy standpoint, and we want to really do the most good, we got to think about these other institutions that reach out more broadly and grab people with less means. Okay, finally, I want to just real quick, because I'm probably running long. I want to touch on just a few additional inequalities and highlight some research I just talked about. So, a few other things: gender wage gap still exists. It's much lower, of course, but we do know that women make less than men, right, in the job market. And there's a lot of explanations for it, and a lot of very interesting economic research that accounts for reasons for that. Okay, for some reasons for that. But it's important to think about it persisting. It's a little different than just income and wealth, but there's other dimensions of heterogeneity that are really important to think about for inequality. This is just one. This is a different one. This is one I want to talk about just very briefly. This is some new research that I'm working on, very exciting right now with a couple of co-authors. We took the SCF, Survey of Consumer Finances, put out by the Federal Reserve Board, thank you, and it's the best data on wealth in the country. It's wonderful. Every 3 years, they sample people randomly, and then they purposely target as well a bunch of very rich zip codes. So they actually get to look at really rich people that you'd never find by random chance. So what we plotted here is the cumulative distribution of wealth. It's a wealth distribution. It basically says, if I read along this axis and I say, oh, there's 400,000. If I go up to one of the lines, it tells me what fraction of the population has that much wealth or less. So that's why these things eventually get out to 1, because at some point you got everybody, right? And the more it goes to the right, the more wealth there is, right? The more unequal it is. And the more it comes back like this, the less wealth there is, and the less, in this case, it's more equal among them. So this is black households and white households in 1962. Black households at the time are facing tremendous discrimination still in residential sorting. And in fact, the median household, not even median, really more, it's effectively near zero wealth, zero net worth. You don't have access to good housing, you don't have a way to really invest in it and to save. So we're aware of that. Said, well, okay, so this was not surprising to see inequality. And then we said, okay, so what about if we look at white households in 2016? Okay, it's really blown up. Yeah, I mean, markets have been great, globalization's been great, people are making a lot of money. But the question is, there's some literature that says, okay, but black households tend to hold less. We said, well, I wonder how much it's catching up. We asked ourselves, how fast should it catch up? We need a model to understand how fast it should catch up. So we did just start with the data. This is what we found when we looked at 2016. This is all in real dollars, by the way. There's no inflation going on here. Black households in the data have still not caught up with their white counterparts from 55 years ago. There are still, and that made us step back and say, whoa, we got to think about what model we're going to write down. What kind of frictions need to be in that model to understand why they haven't converged, right? Why they haven't converged. So that's where we're starting. That's what we're really excited to dig into. So anyway, thank you very much for having me out. It was a great honor, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
where fewer of younger people are moving from where they started
Yeah.
geographically.
Yeah.
Is there a sociological variable? Because there's a big generational gap that I find in my students who want to live close to their parents, as opposed to previous generations who wanted to get as far away from them as possible.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if the mobility factor has a variable, or if anyone's looked at the variable of sociology rather than economics.
Yeah. So some of my colleagues actually joke with me and say that I'm becoming the new sociology of economics. that's their. No. Yeah. So, but yes, there are famous economists that have tried to think about some sociological issues and put them in their models. I do think so. So the one thing I can speak directly to about staying close to your parents, actually at the Cleveland Fed, there's a commentary up and also a working paper for the more technical side of it, looking at on the labor end. The labor market and unemployment spells of people who live close to parents versus farther away from their parents. And it was really fascinating. They find that actually people who live close to their parents do better. They do better in terms of having lower unemployment spells. So one thinking, when an economist first hears that, a lot of times they think, oh, well, the one who moved far away is probably going to do better, because there's probably a skill selection there. The reason they moved far away is they were really good and they got a job someplace. And of course, they're going to be great in the market. They're going to find somebody. But what they actually find is that those who live close to their parents do better. They're not entirely sure why. So we're going to read it more carefully. But yes, the role of parents and proximity to parents is actually very helpful, it seems, at least in the labor market side, and that should help you accumulate wealth. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. I noticed you didn't say anything about tax policy. I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
I don't want to get you in trouble, but I just want to know what your thoughts are on the role of income and wealth taxes on both concentration of wealth and mobility.
Okay. So real quick, I want to remind everybody of the disclaimer. Okay, it's really important, especially since I understand this is being videotaped. So I want to be very careful about it. But I have a deep passion and interest. In fact, I wrote my dissertation on issues around progressive income taxation. So I'm really interested in how this stuff works. Now, at the same time, there's sort of better ways to do this, perhaps more efficient ways to tax and less efficient ways to tax. There's always trade-offs. I think that's the big thing here. We'd love to be able to say, let's just make stuff equal and everybody would be happy and be fine. But we understand there's costs to doing that, right? So if I go out and I say, let's go get Bill Gates, right? Let's go get Bezos. Let's go get these guys, and we'll take their wealth and we'll distribute it back to everyone else, right? We understand it's going to have an effect on people's desire to take risky projects, to start big businesses that employ millions of people, right, and create tremendous amounts of wealth. We understand that if you tax, say, the surgeons at very high rates, like we did in the 60s, 90% tax rates, marginal tax rates, like really, really high tax rates. Okay? There's two effects. One is, you're probably going to have an effect on people's decisions to try to push to get that kind of income, right? So fewer people are going to find it worthwhile to forego consumption for a long time to get all the expertise in medicine and wait till they're 40 to have a high income, because they're not going to get to enjoy as much of it. The other thing that's more interesting is when you think about the behavior of CEOs and others, you can always kind of get around that, right? So they would game the system in a way to try to take compensation that wasn't taxed, right? So instead of just getting a fat salary, you make other demands, right? So at a certain point, it gets very hard to. So I want to say that because I want everyone to respect the fact that you can't just go out and take everything and shuffle it around and it's going to be great. It's going to have real consequences. On the other hand, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that just lowering taxes and allowing inequality to really run up trickles down to everyone else, right? I don't think there's a lot of evidence of that either. And so I am dancing a little bit around your question, right? It kind of depends on the model as to what the right way to tax is. We understand that taxing capital has some inefficiencies over time. As you tax capital, people accumulate it less, and that's worse for people over time. But we understand that taxing labor also hurts people. The other problem is when you try to tax, say, consumption, right? Let's have big sales taxes. People like that in some sense because they say, oh, that's fair. If you eat a lot, then you got to get taxed for it. That seems fair. The problem is, as a percentage of your income, consumption's higher for the poor than for the rich, right? The rich save more. So it becomes a very aggressive tax. So then you think, well, maybe we can exempt them. I mean, I've thought of ideas like maybe everybody should get back, maybe we should tax consumption at a flat high rate of like 30% or something. I don't know, it's a number. But then give everybody a check. Give everybody like a $15,000 check or a $20,000 check or something, right? So that those who are poor actually get money from the system. And for those that are wealthy, they get a nice flat consumption tax. I mean, these are ideas, but they're not ones being discussed in Congress, and nobody's called me up to ask. So, actually, you've shown the most interest. So, yeah.
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the small businesses. Are there certain types of small businesses that seem to be very successful nowadays?
Well, okay, so I'm going to have to first pause. I don't have a good understanding of which small businesses are more successful than others. However, I do want to make people aware of something, and that is that the distribution in general of small business owners in terms of income, it looks a lot like the US distribution. So it isn't that small business owners tend to have a lot of money. They really don't. Like everyone else, okay? And entrepreneurs can be. It's that the thing about the wealth mobility part of it, though, is that the ones that sort of do really well and upsize their business or have an idea and they're able to sell their business, they go really big. They go really, really big, and so that's where we can start pulling people. But there is this common, I think there's a fallacy out there. I'm not accusing you of this. It's something that came to mind that you brought to my mind that people have had, that small business owners, that's the way you get rich. And for most people, it's not the case. For most people, it's just an income source. And their incomes look very similar to others. I can't tell you specifically, though, about any particular business that's better than others. Otherwise, I guess I should start a business, and the one that I know is likely to win. But I don't know that exactly.
Yeah, I'd like to return to the question regarding the tax bill that just made its way through the House of Representatives on its way to the Senate.
Right.
Several tax researchers or analysts have suggested that 80% of the so-called tax cuts in this bill will go to the top 1%. And if that's true, that's going to aggravate this whole situation for us. What is your take on this current tax measure that's making its way through the system?
Okay. So I can't give an official opinion. Okay, so I'm not going to give an official opinion. I really can't do that. I can talk about a major component of it, corporate income taxation, right? One thing I'd like to take the opportunity to do, and actually it's sort of ironic because it's gone back and forth in the news at times over the years, is whether corporations are people or not, right? We've heard this statement, corporations are people, and I know I'm probably already getting myself in trouble. I'm trying to backtrack. But in some sense, a corporation is in fact an entity. It takes resources, it's a management organizational setup, right? But obviously, the proceeds from that corporation go to different people in different amounts, right? So those who likely are going to gain from a large reduction in the corporate income tax rate are those who are going to be drawing a lot of dividends, those who are going to be getting a lot of capital gains from businesses, right? And so that's going to fall in the 1%, like we just showed, right? The 1%. So people in that upper echelon of wealth are going to benefit greatly from it. Whether you want to do that or not is guided by your philosophy about how things should be distributed and what's fair and not fair, and I have to be very careful about championing one social welfare function over another. But it is true that the gains would go greatly to a very small fraction, and that would give them more resources to invest and would almost certainly exacerbate inequality. Absolutely. Did I do that right? I don't know. Did I dance around enough? Sorry.
One piece of conventional wisdom among conservatives is that higher tax rates for wealthy people discourage incentive and destroys initiative. Mm-hmm. I'm no expert, but from what I've read, there is zero evidence of this being the case in very high tax countries like Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. Yeah. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so the idea from the supply side view would be that by lowering the marginal tax rate on investment, you encourage investment, right? You encourage people to save, and those who have the money to save can be wealthy. By having more savings, you increase capital in the economy. Capital becomes more abundant relative to labor. That should drive up wages, right? And that should then trickle down to all the people who are working, right? Because all of a sudden their labor becomes more and more valuable. Okay. Yes, the empirical work on looking at whether, for instance, tax cuts tend to lead to higher growth, for instance, is a very mixed bag. And at least at where I'm at right now, and my understanding of this and my reading of literature is that it's inconclusive, that we do not know that tax cuts spur growth. Now, in a theoretical sense, we know that there are ranges of tax rates that must, right? I know that if I tax 100%, I know for sure that you're going to stymie everything, right? And I know that if you don't tax anything, you're going to get a lot of stuff happening for sure, right? You're not going to raise any revenue, right? But you're not. What you're going to do. So I know that at the extremes something happens, but the real ambiguity is where you get this Laffer curve, as it's called, and it's an actual thing. The Laffer curve's there, right? There's a Laffer curve. The question is always which side you're on, right? And how steep it is, and where's the top at, and we don't know. There's different views. I've seen as high as 70% on labor income taxes, for instance, and I've seen when you take models that have other kinds of frictions they bet in there that seem somewhat reasonable, they might drop to 40% as the optimal tax rate. So there's a lot of ambiguity about that. I would say the one thing I can emphatically say is that the certainty that you hear about the effects of tax cuts is not borne out in the literature. That I can say for sure.
According to you, according to you, hello?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi. Sorry about that.
According to you, which is the most important factor which contributes to the social progress index?
The social progress index?
Yes.
I'm not familiar with the social progress index. The stuff I was showing though, like what's the most important factor for that? For like the Gini's and the
no,
social progress index. I'm not familiar with the social progress index. What is? I'm sorry. What is the social progress index?
So it enables the society to use the full potential to create economic and social development, which increases the economic growth of the country.
Okay. So this is I don't know how the index is measured, so it's going to be a little hard to talk about, for me at least, what factors are likely to increase the index or not increase the index. I can say, I think, and maybe you guys can correct me if I'm way off, but what immediately comes to mind when I think about development, which I think this is a question about economic development, I'm interpreting it that way, are institutions. That's the big one for me. I think about the role of institutions in society, and it's actually fairly topical right now, even for the US. But can you trust, for instance, that if I invest in a business that I'm going to actually get the money from that business, right? Can I trust that the money that I put into it will still be there? Even that, will it be taken, right? Can I trust that if I show up and work, my employer will actually pay me in 2 weeks, right? Or in a month? And do I have recourse to go after people if they don't, right? Do I have institutions where I can trust that I can send my kids to a building and they can get educated in order to have future labor income, right? And do that safely. I mean, the more I look at these issues, there's so many small frictions. Actually, they're huge for the people going through them, but there's so many frictions that make what seem routine, I think, for many of us in the States, very hard for people in certain countries, right? In certain countries. We had, for instance, just to take a moment, I hope I'm not running way too long, but when my daughter was in 5th grade, she's a senior now, but when she was in 5th grade, they read a book, and it started with an I, and I should remember what it's called. But it's about a young man who, and please, someone yell it out if they know the name of this book, but he's basically sold into slavery. He's, I believe, Pakistani boy. He's sold into slavery because his family's falls into debt, right? They're basically farmers, and with the vicissitudes of nature, they end up in a bad circumstance, and they give him away into slavery, and he makes rugs, right? He makes rugs to get sold. And it's this really sad story. It's actually a true story. Eventually, his circumstances improve greatly, and he's able to come to the United States, tell his story, and it's a beautiful, beautiful story. But the reason I bring it up is that one of the reactions of the parents in the reading group with the kids was, well, what we need to do is stop buying rugs, you know? Stop buying rugs. Because if you stop buying rugs, then you'll shut down the whole trade, and then they'll go to school, and everything will get better, right? But maybe if you're in the States and you have a great public school and someone's sneaking kids off, enslaving them, and doing, yeah, that makes sense, boycott the rugs. But if the outside option of not, right, the outside option of not being sold into slavery to make rugs is that you try to somehow eke out a living, right, on whatever plot of land you have, and you're still at risk from all the movement, that doesn't necessarily improve their lot either, right? What do you need there is an institution called credit, right? You need some force that's able to come in and say, I can lend to you now to help cover this, and I understand that, yes, things will go up and down, but over time, you'll pay me back. And all of a sudden, the family can work, they can afford to have a kid leave the household for the day instead of working and get an education. You know, I mean, these are thoughts that you're sparking in my mind, as I don't exactly know the index. But I hope that helps, right? Does anyone know the name of that book, by the way? I'm sure it's a nice, it's a great book if you get a chance to read it.
Let's have maybe one more question, and then we'll...
Yeah, and then you can totally accost me later. I'll be outside.
In your presentations, I seem to pick up a note that primary education is very instrumental in upward economic mobility.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because a lot of effort has been given to higher education,
Yep.
some elite universities, but the basic fundamental education setup all goes up from primary education,
Yes.
moves them into that sphere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't, we would see, so when I was at Virginia, for instance, a great public institution, and they had programs, they would try to reach out. Maybe somebody with lower circumstances, they go to a community college for a year, get good grades, and then they get automatic acceptance into UVA. And that's great. I mean, it's great to offer those opportunities to people. But as someone who taught some of those classes while I was in graduate school, I tell you, it was so trying to teach intermediate macroeconomics with a calculus base to students. When some of the students come from out of state, these are kids who turn down Cornell, Brown, maybe even Princeton or Harvard because, you know, they have some sort of relationship to the South and they want to be at Virginia, right, the university. You have kids who come from Northern Virginia, from the DC area, who go to great private schools. These kids are sharp, and they're just going, and they're driving the class. And then I have kids, say, from Southwest Virginia, of much lower means, and with much lower investment in there, on average. I'm not disparaging Southwest, but we know that economically there's a lot of inequality within Virginia in that way, geographically. And they come into those classes, and you say, great, there's your opportunity. But the success rate's much lower. It's very, very hard for you to expect that a kid who's had 12 to 18 years of human capital that's been deprived relative to someone else is going to somehow perform at the same level. Can't do it. My wife, you know, again, this is recorded, so I'm really nervous, but she recruits in the Cleveland Metro School Districts, and sometimes she tells me it can be really heartbreaking because everyone's looking for that diamond in the rough, that jewel that's hidden. But what you come into is you come into places and you see the hope that people have, and you want to tell them, hey, you know, if you can get through this, there's a great opportunity here. And then when they see the standards to even be able to survive in that environment, and you say, I don't know if they're going to build it, if this is the right opportunity. And that kind of gets to this idea of universities that you don't have to jump to the 20 percentile right away, you know? It may take a generation or two, right? But coming up out of poverty into the middle class is actually pretty awesome, right? And maybe you have a chance for your own kids. So, yeah, it's instrumental.